In Athens, there is a lump of corroded bronze. For 2 years after it came out of the sea, nobody looked at it properly. It was catalogued. It was shelved. It sat in a museum full of statues while everyone admired the statues. Then somebody noticed a gear wheel inside it. Then another. Then 30. What came out of that lump is the most sophisticated object surviving from the ancient world. A geared analog computer, built somewhere around the 2nd century before the Common Era, that predicted eclipses decades in advance. And that is not the case we are opening today. How it worked is largely solved, and I will show you the solution. The case is what happens next, which is nothing. For 1,000 years, nothing of comparable complexity appears anywhere on Earth. The explanation exists. It is not what the internet tells you. And the decisive piece of evidence was written down by a Roman lawyer 2,000 years ago, sitting in plain sight in a book everybody has read, and nobody connected it for 100 years. Autumn 1900. A crew of Greek sponge divers out of the island of Symi, working the Mediterranean under Captain Dimitrios Kontos, gets caught by weather and shelters in the lee of a small island between Crete and the Peloponnese called Antikythera. While they wait it out, they dive. A diver named Elias Stadiatis goes down off a point on the coast and comes back up in a state. The account that has come down to us has him describing a heap of rotting corpses and horses on the sea floor. He had found bronze arms, marble limbs, a field of statuary lying in the dark at around 45 meters. Understand what 45 meters meant in 1900. This is standard diving dress, canvas and rubber, a copper helmet, air pumped down a hose by men turning a wheel on the deck above. Nobody has worked out decompression theory yet. Nobody knows what nitrogen does to a body under pressure. The salvage ran into 1901 with the support of the Greek Navy, and it cost them. 1 diver died. 2 more were left paralyzed. That is the price of this artifact, paid up front, before anybody had the faintest idea what they were bringing up. And what they brought up was extraordinary by any measure. Bronze and marble statues, including a magnificent bronze youth, glassware, jewelry, coins, furniture fittings, the cargo of a ship that went down around 70 to 60 years before the Common Era, most likely carrying Greek goods westward toward Rome. All of it went to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where it was unpacked, catalogued, and put on display, except for 1 crate, which nobody could make sense of at all. Here is what the corroded mass looked like when it arrived. Bronze that had spent 2,000 years in salt water, encrusted, swollen, split, with fragments of decayed wood attached to it. The museum had bigger things to think about. It had just received one of the finest collections of ancient bronze statuary ever recovered in one operation. The youth got the attention. The philosopher's head got the attention. The lump got a shelf, and it stayed there, through the rest of 1901, through the winter, into the following spring. In May of 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stais was going back over the material and looked at the lump properly. Set into the corrosion, unmistakably, was a toothed bronze wheel, a gear, in an object from a wreck dated to the 1st century before the Common Era. The most sophisticated artifact in the history of ancient technology spent 2 years in a museum being described as a lump of bronze. In fairness to everyone involved, it looked exactly like a lump of bronze. Stais suggested it might be some kind of astronomical clock. He was substantially right, roughly 70 years before anyone could prove it, and the response from the field at the time was largely that this was impossible. Not impossible in the sense of difficult, impossible in the sense that gearing of this kind was not supposed to exist for another millennium and a half, and therefore something had gone wrong with the dating, or the object, or Stais. That objection has never entirely gone away, and to be fair to the people making it, it is the correct instinct. When an object turns up 1,500 years ahead of everything around it, the first thing you should check is whether it really belongs there. It does, and the way we know is that somebody finally counted the teeth. The inventory then. This is what survives. 82 fragments, 7 of them substantial, labelled A through G, and 75 smaller pieces, ranging down to chips. Inside those fragments, at least 30 bronze gear wheels survive. That number matters, so hold on to it. 30 is what we physically have. Reconstructions propose more in the complete machine, with different models arriving at different totals depending on what they think the front display did. When you hear larger figures quoted, those are reconstructions, not survivals. Both are legitimate. They are not the same thing. The gear teeth are triangular, cut into bronze plate, and they run at around 1 millimeter, about the thickness of the wire in a paperclip. The largest surviving gear is roughly 13 centimeters across and carries 223 teeth. That number is not decorative, and it is not arbitrary. Remember it, because in 2 modules it is going to explain the entire machine. All of this sat inside a wooden case, about 34 centimeters by 18 by 9, a shoebox. The whole thing was the size of a shoebox, with dials on the front and back, and a hand crank on the side. Now, the correction I owe you, because the thumbnail said computer, and the word is doing a job it cannot quite do. This is not a computer in the sense you are picturing. It does not store a program. You cannot give it a different task. It has no memory, and it makes no decisions. It is an analog mechanical calculator with a fixed function, and that function is baked permanently into the tooth counts of its gears. And I want to be clear that this makes it more impressive rather than less, because a programmable machine is flexible. You can be wrong about something and fix it in software. This is the opposite. Everything this device knows about the sky is expressed as a ratio between 2 numbers of teeth, cut into metal, permanently. To build it, somebody had to already know the right answer, to a precision that would survive decades of turning, and then commit that answer to bronze where it could never be revised. They got it right, which raises a question nobody wants to ask out loud. With what tools? If you have ever cut a gear, or rebuilt a gearbox, or even just replaced a timing belt and counted the teeth to line it up, this next part is going to sit differently with you than it does with most people. There is no dividing head in the 2nd century before the Common Era. No index plate, no milling machine, no hobbing cutter, no optical comparator, no micrometer. To make a gear today, you clamp a blank in a dividing head, which mechanically guarantees that you advance the blank by exactly the same angle for every tooth, and then you cut. The machine enforces the accuracy. That is the entire point of the machine. The maker of this device had none of that. The evidence in the metal suggests the layout was scribed by hand, dividing a circle by eye and by construction, and the teeth were then cut with files. Now think about what that means as an error problem, because this is where it stops being impressive and becomes slightly unnerving. In a gear train, error does not stay put. It accumulates. Every gear passes its inaccuracy to the next one, and every revolution multiplies it. A small spacing error on one wheel becomes a visible pointer error further down the train, and this machine has trains running through many stages to produce outputs measured in decades. A device tracking a 19-year cycle has to hold its accuracy across 19 years of turning. A device tracking a 54-year cycle has to hold it across 54. Analysis of the surviving tooth counts shows they are not sloppy. There is variation, because it is handwork, but the counts are the counts the astronomy requires, and the trains produce the outputs they are supposed to produce. Somebody sat in a workshop with a file and hand-cut teeth a millimeter long, hundreds of them, and got the ratios right. There is one more absence worth naming here, because it changes what you are picturing. There is no escapement in this machine. No spring, no weight drive, no ticking regulator releasing energy in measured amounts. That is the component that turns a gear train into a clock, and it does not appear anywhere in the world for another 13 centuries. So this device does not keep time. It cannot. Left alone, it does nothing at all. What it has instead is a crank on the side. You turn it, and the whole state of the sky winds forward or backward with it. You are not reading a clock. You are driving a model of the heavens to whatever date you want, and then reading off what the sky will be doing when you get there. That is a fundamentally different kind of object, and arguably a stranger one. And they got the ratios right because somebody else had already worked out what the ratios needed to be, which is the other half of this object, and the more remarkable half. Time to collect on that number. Start with something you can see for yourself. The moon goes from new to full and back to new in about 29.5 days. That is a synodic month, and it is the oldest unit of time human beings have. Now, eclipses. A solar eclipse happens when the moon passes exactly between the Earth and the Sun. That should happen every new moon, and it obviously does not, because the moon's orbit is tilted, so most months it passes above or below, but the geometry repeats. After a specific number of months, the Sun, Earth and Moon return to almost the same relative arrangement, and the eclipse pattern starts over. That number of months is 223, roughly 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. The Babylonians worked it out from centuries of patient records, and it is now called the Saros cycle. 223 teeth, on the largest gear in the machine. That is what this device is. Somebody took the deepest pattern in Babylonian eclipse astronomy and cut it into a bronze wheel. On the back of the case, The lower dial is a spiral of 4 turns, divided into 223 cells, one per month, with small glyphs marking the months in which an eclipse is predicted, and in many cases, what kind and roughly when. You turn the crank. The pointer walks the spiral. It tells you when the sky is going to go dark, and there is a refinement on top of it that I find almost funnier than the main achievement. Remember that 8 hours left over at the end of each Saros. That extra third of a day means the same eclipse comes back at a different time of day, and therefore over a different part of the world. 3 Saros cycles brings it back around to the same time of day. 54 years. The machine has a small subsidiary dial for exactly that correction. Somebody looked at a device that predicts eclipses 18 years out and thought, yes, but it will be 8 hours off. The upper back dial handles a different problem, which is the oldest headache in calendar making. Lunar months and solar years do not divide into one another. 235 lunar months come out almost exactly equal to 19 solar years, a relationship called the Metonic cycle, and that dial is a 5-turn spiral of 235 cells with a further refinement dial beside it. So we have eclipses, and we have the calendar, both to a standard that would not be matched for centuries. And then, on the same backplate, there is a dial that has nothing to do with astronomy at all. Set into the upper back of the mechanism is a small subsidiary dial divided into 4. It is not tracking a planet. It is not tracking the moon. It is a 4-year cycle, and around its face are inscribed the names of athletic festivals: Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, Pythia, and at least 1 or 2 more regional games alongside them. It tells you when the games are on. Take a moment with that, because it quietly reframes the entire object. Up to this point, you have been picturing an instrument, something belonging to an observatory, or an astronomer, or a philosophical school, a research tool. Research tools do not have a dial for the Olympics. This is a device that predicts eclipses, reconciles the lunar and solar calendars, tracks the phase of the moon, and reminds you when the games are. That is not a laboratory instrument. That is a civic object, something that sits in an important house, or a temple, or a public building and gets consulted, and gets pointed at, and gets shown to visitors, which raises the question this case keeps circling back to. Who was the customer? Somebody commissioned this. Somebody paid for it. Somebody expected to be able to use it, and expected that the games dial would be useful to them, which tells you they were Greek, they were wealthy, and they were the kind of person for whom the festival calendar mattered. And a customer implies a supplier. You do not commission a one-off from a workshop that has never made one before. But before we get to who made it, there is one piece of the machine I have deliberately held back. It is the single most sophisticated thing in the box, and for decades, nobody understood it was there. Here is a fact about the moon that you can verify with patience and nothing else. It does not move across the background of stars at a constant rate. Sometimes it runs faster, sometimes slower, on a cycle of roughly a month. The Greeks knew this and called it the lunar anomaly. The reason is that the moon's orbit is an ellipse rather than a circle, so it moves faster when it is closer to us and slower when it is further away. Any device that models the moon with a plain gear train will get this wrong. Gears turn at constant ratios. That is what gears are for. So how do you build a mechanism whose output speeds up and slows down, using components that cannot do that? The answer is in the machine, and it is beautiful. Take 2 gears with the same number of teeth. Mount them face to face, one on top of the other. Fix a small pin sticking up from the first gear, and cut a radial slot in the second, and drop the pin into the slot so the first gear drives the second through it. If both gears turned on exactly the same center, nothing interesting would happen. Same tooth count, same axis, same speed, but they are not on the same center. The 2 axes are offset slightly, so as the assembly rotates, the pin slides in and out along the slot. When it is near the outer end, it drives the second gear through a long effective radius, and the output runs slow. When it slides inward, the effective radius shortens, and the output runs fast. One rotation, one smooth cycle of speeding up and slowing down. That is a pin and slot drive, and this machine uses it to reproduce the moon's variable speed across the sky. And the whole arrangement sits on a rotating platform, so that the direction of the effect turns slowly over years to follow the slow rotation of the moon's orbit itself. Somebody took a mathematical model of an astronomical irregularity and expressed it as a physical relationship between 2 pieces of bronze and a pin. You have opened a gearbox and counted teeth. Now imagine designing that, at a millimeter, with files. For roughly 70 years after Stice found the first gear wheel, Nobody knew that mechanism was in there. Nobody could see inside the corrosion. The case sat effectively closed because the evidence was sealed in a lump you were not allowed to cut open. What broke it open was not archaeology. It was industrial imaging. The investigative history of this object is a story about instruments, and it runs through 3 generations. The first is Derek de Solla Price, a British-born historian of science at Yale, who spent decades on it from the 1950s. Working with the Greek radiographer Charalampos Karakalos, he got gamma radiography onto the fragments in the early 70s and published his reconstruction, Gears from the Greeks, in 1974. Price was the first person to see the machine as a machine and to publish tooth counts and a working gear scheme. He got a great deal right, including the metonic function. He also got things wrong, notably in proposing a differential gear arrangement that later work did not support. That is not a criticism. That is what a first reconstruction from shadow images looks like. The second generation is Michael Wright, a curator at the Science Museum in London, working in part with Alan Bromley. Wright used linear tomography, which let him build up slices through the fragments rather than flat shadows. And crucially, he did something academics rarely do. He built the thing, physical working models, in metal, which is a form of proof no diagram can give you, because a model that cannot be assembled tells you your reconstruction is wrong. Wright identified the pin and slot lunar mechanism and argued for a planetary display years before it was widely accepted. The third generation arrives in 2005, and this is where it gets slightly absurd. The Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, led on the academic side by Mike Edmonds of Cardiff, and with Tony Freeth driving much of the imaging work, wanted microfocus X-ray computed tomography on the fragments. That means a machine capable of resolving detail inside dense corroded metal in 3 dimensions. The relevant machine weighed around 8 tons and lived in England. The fragments are not permitted to leave the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, so they shipped the scanner to the artifact. An 8-ton industrial X-ray system, crated, freighted to Greece, and assembled inside a museum, because the alternative was moving a shoebox. Alongside it came reflectance imaging, photographing the surfaces under light from many different angles, and combining the results to make faint marks readable, which lifted inscriptions off surfaces that look blank to the eye. The results published in Nature in 2006 and 2008 transformed the case. They confirmed the Saros eclipse dial, established the games dial, and read month names pointing toward a Corinthian calendar tradition. A revised model of the front display came from a University College London team including Freeth in 2021, and it remains a reconstruction rather than a survival. And the scans found something nobody expected: text. A great deal of it. Thousands of characters of Greek writing survive on the plates and fragments of this device. Around 3,500 had been recovered and published by the middle of the last decade, and the original is estimated to have carried a great deal more. It is not decoration, it is not dedication, it is not a maker's signature, it is instructions. The text describes what the dials show. It explains the display. It tells the reader what they are looking at and how to interpret it. There is astronomical description. There is guidance on the pointers. There is material that reads like the accompanying documentation for a piece of equipment. Somebody wrote a user manual, in Greek, on the outside of the machine. Now apply the logic of the file to that. You do not write instructions for yourself. You know how your own machine works. Instructions exist because somebody who is not you is going to have to operate this, and you will not be standing next to them when they do, which means this device had an expected user who was not its maker. And an expected user implies an expected transaction, a commission, a delivery, a handover, possibly a sale, and a transaction implies a market, even a very small one, even one with a handful of customers and one workshop, which is the moment the case stops being about an impossible object and starts being about a missing industry. For the whole of this episode, I have let you believe you were watching an anomaly, one machine, alone, 1,500 years ahead of everything around it, with nothing before it and nothing after it. That is the popular version, and it is almost certainly wrong, and the evidence against it was published in the 1st century before the Common Era by a Roman politician and lawyer whose books have never once been out of circulation. Cicero, writing at roughly the same time this ship was sinking, describes mechanical devices that model the heavens. In one passage he describes a sphere brought back to Rome from Syracuse by the general Marcellus, attributed to Archimedes, which reproduced the motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets, and he describes it being demonstrated. In another, he refers to a device recently made by Posidonius, which did the same thing. Cicero is not describing this object. I want to be exact about that. He does not give us gear counts, and he is not writing a technical report, and anyone who tells you he described the Antikythera mechanism is overreaching. What he gives us is something more useful. Independent written testimony, contemporary with the wreck, that geared or mechanical astronomical models existed, that more than one of them existed, that they were associated with named individuals, and that an educated Roman could expect his readers to know what he was talking about. That is a tradition, not a miracle. A tradition, with practitioners and patrons and a body of technique. So here is the verdict. We have one of these because one of them sank. Bronze is worth money. Broken bronze is worth almost as much as intact bronze, because you melt it and cast it again. Across antiquity and the entire medieval period, bronze objects that stopped being useful were recycled continuously and without sentiment. A geared calculator with a snapped shaft is not a museum piece to the person holding it. It is raw material. Look at what survives, and the pattern is unmistakable. Almost every significant large bronze from the ancient world that we possess came out of the sea. The Riace warriors, the Artemian god, the youth from this very wreck. They survived because they went underwater, where nobody could reach them with a crucible. The most famous exception proves the rule. The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius in Rome survived above ground through the entire medieval period, largely because it was mistaken for Constantine, and Constantine was Christian, so nobody melted it. It lived because of a case of mistaken identity. That is the survival rate we are dealing with. And a shoebox full of fine bronze gearwork has no chance at all against it. Every one of these that broke, anywhere, at any point in 1500 years, went into a furnace. The 1,000-year silence after the Antikythera mechanism is not a silence in human capability. It is a silence in the record, produced by the scrap value of the material it was made from. And the record does eventually pick back up. Al-Biruni describes a geared calendar device around the 11th century. A geared astrolabe made by Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr survives from the early 13th. By the 14th century, Europe is building astronomical clocks, including the work of Richard of Wallingford at St. Albans, and the astrarium of Giovanni da Dondi, which ran to over 100 gears and took him 16 years. The gap is real on the shelf. It is probably false in the world. So the case closes, and it closes in the opposite direction from where it opened. This object is not evidence that somebody impossible visited the ancient Mediterranean. It is evidence that we have lost almost everything, and that what we know of ancient technology is assembled from the small percentage of it that happened to be somewhere a scrap dealer could not go. We are not looking at the peak of ancient engineering. We are looking at the one piece that fell in the water. And there are two defensible ways to read that. So tell me which one you land on. Either there were hundreds of these, a whole quiet industry of them, and we hold one purely by the accident of a storm off Antikythera, or this was an exceptional object even in its own time, the high watermark of one unusually brilliant workshop, and the devices Cicero mentions were simpler things that flattered by comparison. I lean toward the first. I am not certain. Argue with me in the comments. If you got something out of this, a like helps more than you would think, and subscribe if you want the rest of the case files. Next time, Case File 002. 16-ton carved pillars in southeastern Turkey, 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and after somebody went to the trouble of building it, somebody else went to the trouble of deliberately burying the entire site. We are going to find out why.